So, welcome to another week of Sunset Boulevard. So far, we've gone through the criticism of Hollywood, why it's bad. We've planned one topic for that, and we've looked at discontent. So, who is discontent or who is unhappy within the film? I think of the remaining themes, the most important ones are manipulation, control, deceit, and self delusion. So these two are actually fairly closely linked. You can often kind of deal with them together. But one really interesting theme that turns up a fair bit is death and also hope. So we'll go over both of those today. Hope is really good to have in your back pocket because generally I think Sunset Boulevard can honestly, you can memorize a lot of content for it. Like, I don't want to say memorize essays because some people memorize essays to try and get good scores and it works. But I didn't do that personally because I feel like it's important to have your analysis, like to be able to vary it for the different topics. So I personally don't recommend people memorize essays, but I do recommend that you kind of memorize certain pieces of evidence you can use to make particular arguments. And frequently, I find Sunset Boulevard essays can be very easily argued with one body paragraph at the start about why Hollywood is bad. So just pick something you don't like about it, generally, like the exploitative nature, the financial manipulation, the financial pressure is like a good thing to put in the first body. And then in the last body, you've kind of got two options. One is to say everything's a disaster and it's all kind of falling apart and there's no hope. Norma goes insane and Joe ends up dead. The other option, though, is to have a more positive paragraph about how there's hope or how the film offers glimpses of hope throughout. So there are a couple of videos on YouTube and other analysis elsewhere that suggest it's quite a hopeful movie. So you can go for that type of analysis if you want. Personally, I like that. I think it's interesting, although it depends a little bit on the topic. You can decide which argument you would rather make. But we will prepare a paragraph for this that you've got that ready to go in case you need. In terms of what to put in your second body paragraph, any of these themes work. So I would pick one of these, an idea you find most interesting from these, to go with your second body and just change it depending on the topic. Generally, something about discontent's pretty good, about how like Norma wants to be young and beautiful again, and Joe's all depressed and emasculated. That tends to work pretty well. So we'll start with death, and I think we will begin by looking at an essay topic. So off the top of my head, the prompt is, actually we don't need quotes. How is death portrayed as a lingering presence in Sunset Boulevard? All right, so to plan this out, what we need to do is think about what are the examples of death in the movie. So where do we see death? In terms of like literal deaths, people actually dying literally, those are the only two real deaths. Can you think of any metaphorical deaths? Dead careers. So that's another type of death that we have. We've got two kind of types of death in the film. One is these literal deaths like Joe and then the monkey. We'll maybe go through these first, knock them over quickly, and then we'll go through all the figurative deaths because these are much more important in the film than the literal ones. The literal ones pervade it, but the metaphorical ones are what it's all really about. So, in terms of Joe, what are some ways that we remember that Joe is dead, aside from at the very start? Yep, so narration in the past, and it's also narrated by a dead guy as well. So, yeah, that's the first thing. So, it's kind of talking to us from the grave, which, if you want a film technique for this, is an example of non diegetic sound, so voiceover. Some other times we see Joe dead. So, he's dead at the start. When else do we see his death? Okay, so the film opens with his death, Then, all throughout the film, he kind of tells us everything from the perspective of a dead man. And then we watch his murder at the end as well. So, a couple of things you can analyze here. Probably the fact that he's talking to us from the grave, I would analyze as just something that helps make this feeling of death sort of pervasive through the film. And then when he gets shot by Norma at the end, this is a good example of how it's kind of representative of life. Like, we all know in the back of our minds that people die and that they're going to end up dead, but it's just sort of like waiting to find out how it happens, especially given right at the start, like, we already know he's going to die. But I had one student say that you kind of forget he's going to die, like, when you're watching it, because he feels so alive. So I don't know, some people like talking about how it's sort of shocking at the end when he does actually die again. And then, of course, him being dead at the start is a really good thing to analyze for sort of the bleak, cynical tone of the film. In terms of the monkey, what does the dead monkey symbolize? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the monkey is kind of like Norma's pet at the beginning. And when the monkey dies, it opens up this hole in her life for Joe to come in and fill emotionally. And so he kind of becomes the new pet. But yeah, as both of you said, that foreshadows his death at the end. And other evidence that Joe kind of represents the monkey, I think the first night he's there, he says he has a dream about a monkey dancing for pennies, kind of symbolizes the role he's going to play as this entertainer in Norma's life, ironically, because she entertains him, but he's kind of like the toy for her. Okay, so joking about the color of the coffin lining, we can say this is kind of ironic, as he doesn't know this will be him later. And then there's that quote about I had a dream about a monkey dancing for pennies. Okay, I think that's solid. I don't have anything else to add for the literal deaths. So let's move on to the metaphorical or figurative deaths. So biggest example of this is career death, sorry. And two key characters here are Joe and Norma. Can you guys think of anyone else whose career dies? So let's maybe take our list of characters. If we pop that here. Does Betty's career die at all? I will put Betty's acting career here because that kind of dies before it gets started. But I will note what you said about how she has kind of less of a career death. Dim figures you may still remember from the silent days. And Joe used to think about them as Norma's waxworks. Two really good quotes you can use. I read an essay which scored reasonably well, where someone had a whole point of analysis about how Buster Keaton, one of the waxworks at one point. So they don't have many speaking lines, which is kind of symbolic because they're non-speaking actors. They're from the silent era. But one of his lines when they're playing is pass, as they're passing the cards around. And this person spent like half a paragraph analyzing how this showed that they were in the past now and time had moved on and they were kind of mourning it. I don't know, personally, I felt like that was a little bit of a stretch, but if you wanted to go into that, you could. Probably a better thing to analyze, though, would be the casting choices here. So the director decided to actually cast genuine former silent film actors. So I can remember Buster Keaton and Anna Q. Nelson. I think there are a few others that I can't remember the names off the top of my head, so you might have to check that. But I would analyze this casting decision because it kind of adds to the reality of the film, benefit of casting people who actually lived the experience they're trying to show. So waxworks are like, have you ever heard of Madame Tussauds? I think it is, like that museum of wax figures. Okay, I think it's like just people or things made out of wax, like wax sculptures. That's something you can analyze as well, the fact that he calls them waxworks. So they're kind of like these lifeless sculptures. They're meant to look, they look like life, but they're actually dead. I don't know, maybe that's something you can analyze actually. Because waxworks are supposed to be things that look lifelike. They almost look like the actual person, but they're dead inside. Whereas here, these people are alive, but maybe they're like emotional. Definitely their careers are over, so we can put that there. Okay, Norma, Joe, Betty, are all done. The waxworks. Debt collectors, I don't feel have a big role here. What about Max? He was briefly a director when he was really young. He was one of the first directors Norma worked with. One good thing to talk about for Max as well is the guy who plays him. His name's just gone out of my head as well. He was a genuine director, also from the silent film era, who kind of fell out of favor. And when he's telling Joe, there used to be 3 big directors, myself, DeMille, and this other guy, and now it's just DeMille left. That's actually kind of true because he was one of the big actors in the big directors, sorry, in the silent era. And he actually took the role, like the role in this film, I believe, because the actual guy, like the actor, the former director, was going through financial trouble. So I always joke that's why Max looks so depressed and everything, because the guy playing him like was salty about having to take the role. But yeah, so his career has ended. It's interesting to think whether or not Norma killed it, because I think you're probably right. He does seem to leave because he wants to follow Norma and just live with her. And they get married and then they get divorced and she marries 3 other guys. So that's an interesting thing. At the same time, though, why do you think Max tries to keep Norma in her delusions? Do either of you have any thoughts on that? I think it's interesting, like now that you've said that Norma kind of killed his career, I think you might be right. It's interesting though, because I think he sees Norma as like a big part of his career. And in a way, there's an argument to be made that he thinks he's keeping Norma's stardom alive, genuinely. Because do you remember when he confronts Joe one evening and he talks to him about how they have to be like careful around Norma and not let her understand the truth. And Joe's like, why don't you just tell her what's going on? And Max says, I made her a star. I cannot let her be destroyed. And there's kind of 2 ways you could interpret that. One is like he genuinely cares about her and he just wants to protect her. And perhaps he doesn't want to see the fallout of her hearing the truth. But another way that you could analyze it is that he views her as the culmination of his directorial career. She is the star that he created, and perhaps he feels like he's keeping his project alive by letting her believe that she's still relevant. So that's something you could maybe mention as well. And there's quite a bit of emphasis on the I made her a star. Okay, Max is done. Artie's career I don't feel is awfully at risk. And Sheldrake, the agent, and DeMille all seem to be going pretty well. So I think we're good for career deaths. Let's go back to Norma though, because I think she's sort of the main career death. So Norma's career is figuratively dead. She's no longer wanted in Hollywood due to her age, and also her association with outmoded silent films. They want people who are more relevant and who are able to do sound as well. There are a couple of symbols and film techniques you can use to analyze Norma's dead career. So there's stuff with the costume, there's stuff with the set or the mise-en-scène. Mise-en-scène basically just means set. It's like all the things that are put on the set and put, like in the frame. So yeah, like all the props, the background, that kind of thing. So Yeah, it is pretty depressing. So juxtaposed against her dead career, I guess that goes to show her state of delusion, how she always believes she's going to get back. Okay, so the dark clothes symbolizes death. In particular, another thing I would note is she wears a mourner's veil on New Year's Eve, which you would think is a time of celebration, but she wears this veil, which is kind of like what widows used to wear at funerals. So that kind of helps show that she's mourning. I think a good way to analyze her costume and the house and the fact that everything kind of feels like a giant funeral is that she consciously believes that she can get back. So consciously, she's deluded. She believes she can get back to the stage, but her subconscious understands that it's not happening, and that's reflected in her house. It's like her house is the mourning subconscious. So that's an interesting thing you can mention as well. So a couple of other things I would mention. Her house is very much like a church. It's full of candles, much like a church. There's this organ played by Max, also kind of like a church. And the other thing is there's heaps of pictures of her former self around. I don't know whether you guys have ever been to a funeral where they have lots of pictures of a person who passed away, and often they pick pictures of them when they're looking like very happy and they're out golfing or swimming or with family, and they always look like young and happy and lively in all these pictures. Norma's house is kind of like that. It's like a funeral for herself. The whole thing has got these big, like, vaulted ceilings. It's all made of stone, like a church. There's an organ in the center. And then, along with all the candles, it's full of pictures of her former self. And they're all pictures of her when she was younger, when she was on stage, none of her off stage. It's all her acting self. And I'm pretty sure they're real pictures of the actual Gloria Swanston, the actress. I might be wrong, but that's what I understand to the best of my information. So it's kind of like a memorial or like a wake. Okay, other things, the symbols of Norma's dead career. What about the fact that the street is called Sunset Boulevard? It is in the sunset of her career. So she made it big, but now it's all coming to an end. Couple of other types of death. Death of freedom or autonomy. So Joe gets trapped by Norma and the lifestyle that she gives him, and as a result, he becomes quite emasculated. So this is symbolized by the loss of his car. And I would talk about the fact that I think he seems to lose a lot of self-confidence. So that's another thing. There's also the death of old Hollywood and silent films as well. So key symbols of this is just the waxworks and Norma, which we already kind of talked about. Related to these, can you think of any other things that die, metaphorically or figuratively, aside from careers and old Hollywood? Death of relationships as well, and sort of partnerships too. It's really hard for Joe to have any self-respect because, yeah, as you said, he just kind of becomes a slave for Norma, which Max kind of does as well, interestingly. And I think this is kind of symbolized by a couple of things, but probably the main thing is just his voiceover. He becomes much more accepting of Norma's control over his life. I think probably the biggest point that really symbolizes that is when he's walking into Norma's house after he moves from the garage to the main bedroom, the husband's room. Because in contrast to when he first goes to Norma's house and Max brings all his stuff in for him and he's really upset about it. He's like, you should take all my stuff back. I don't want to be here. This time, when he gets moved into the main house, he's like, well, I guess and I wasn't going anywhere anyway. And he even carries some of his stuff himself, which is interestingly juxtaposed with the start. So you could note that carries his own things into the main house. Why would he make Joe the narrator? That's a good question. I guess it gives us extra insight into Joe's mind, and it also kind of shows his perspective when he was alive. versus when he was dead and how that changes. It's also kind of interesting that it's quite a successful film and Joe gets to be sort of like the scriptwriter for it as well, but it's only after he's dead. I don't know. I feel like you can analyze that kind of thing, the symbolism of it, but I don't know why he'd make Joe the narrator specifically. One thing is it helps make Joe more relatable to the audience. And also he finally gets his big debut on screen only after he's dead. And I don't know, I guess it shows some other things, like how he wants ownership of his story as well. Like he wants to tell it before all the reporters get their hands on it and twist it out of proportion, as he says. So that's another thing. So relationships and partnerships die. Plenty of partnerships. I think probably the biggest ones that are worth analysing are Norma and Joe, Joe and Betty and Artie. That whole love triangle is quite problematic. And the other one would be Norma, DeMille, and Norma's former husbands. Not quite as big of a deal, but all of these have some kind of fracture in them at some point. All these relationships end up dying. Okay, and then I think the last major thing which dies in the film is dreams. So we see a lot of hope turning into cynicism. Whose dreams do you think die in the film? I think you can argue either way as to whether or not he loses his career as a producer. I think he does in a literal sense, but I think he's also kind of deluded about keeping Norma, his star, alive. So, kind of bit of a tension there. Then Norma as well, you're right, it's not super clear because her dream doesn't necessarily die. Like, it feels like she still has her dream. It almost feels like she achieves it because she thinks she achieves it, but it does turn her completely delusional, I guess. So interestingly, she believes she has achieved her dream again. She just totally loses her mind at the end. Joe's dreams definitely die though. Like he wanted to be known for an original work and he never got it, at least while he was alive. But then yeah, you're right. In his voiceover, he does kind of get to. Yeah, so he kind of sells out his soul a little bit. I don't know, did we talk about this already in the previous weeks? Okay, we talked about it very, very briefly, I think, in the first week, about how he's kind of under all this financial pressure. So at the start, he's talking about how I have to create an original story. Perhaps my stories are too original, perhaps they're not original enough, but I just want to create that original story by or original screenplay by. So he wants to create this original work, but he never gets it. And he kind of sells out. So when he's asked if he's a writer, he responds, "That was last year. This year I'm trying to make a living." And when Betty says to him, "Why don't you take out all this stuff about like psychology? Like it just doesn't make any sense." He says, "What do you mean? Psychopaths sell like hotcakes," which I feel they just really show how he doesn't care about creating good art or like a realistic representation of life anymore. He only cares about making money, making a living. So you could talk about that. And you could analyze that two ways. One is the pressure of Hollywood so bad that people have to give up on being artists. The other one is you could just say this is just a Joe problem. He just responds to it all very cynically. So either would probably be okay. All right. So his dreams die. Can you think of anything else that symbolizes the death of his dreams? Yeah, loss of his car. Two other things you can analyze is the fact that when he's dead, he's face down in the pool, so facing away from the fame and all the dreams that he had. So the photographers are all snapping their pictures of him, but he's dead. The other thing I would talk about is the fact that he died in a pool. So in Sunset Boulevard, the pool is a really big symbol of success, like Hollywood success and dreams. And so the fact that he died in this pool that he'd always wanted, and he got it in the end, only the price was a little high, cost him his life, kind of shows the irony. Okay, last thing possibly is like death of sanity, maybe. So Norma really is the only example here. Possibly Max. I had someone ask whether Max and Norma kind of feed off each other's delusions. I hadn't really thought about Max being deluded until that person suggested it. And then I thought, actually, it's not a bad analysis. Okay, so I think we've gone over all the metaphorical deaths, career, freedom, self respect, old Hollywood, relationships, and dreams. And so the last thing I would maybe touch on is symbols of death. So, can you think of anything that symbolizes death other than sort of Norma's house and costume, like we already talked about? I agree with that. The house is decaying, it's rotting. Um, Joe describes it as being like that Miss Havisham in her rotting veil. This is actually a really good quote to analyze. Have you heard of the Miss Havisham thing before? If not, basically, it's based on a Charles Dickens book, I think Great Expectations. And there's a character in that book called Miss Havisham, who is this cranky, old, man hating woman. And when she was like really young, she was engaged to get married to this guy against all her family's best advice. She came from a very wealthy family. And on the morning of her wedding, she got all dressed up and went to the church and found that she'd been jilted. The guy had defrauded her of a bunch of money and hadn't turned up to the wedding. Yeah, so her response to that, this character's response in the Charles Dickens book, was to stop all the clocks in her house at that time. I think it was like 8:45 or 9:45 in the morning. And she never got out of her wedding dress. She spent the rest of her life in this dress and this veil, and it all became all like tattered and rotting and so on. So it kind of symbolizes how Norma is stuck in the past. She's like frozen in time, just like this Miss Havisham was. So that's a really good thing to talk about. It's an example of illusion. So that's something you could note as well. Okay, what else would I jot down about the house? Couple of other quotes. Joe says it's the type of house that crazy movie people built in the crazy 20s, and it kind of shows the forgotten era of the Hollywood silent film. But at the same time, it also foreshadows Norma going crazy at the end. So that's the house. A lot of it is also filmed in darkness or night or even indoors rather than outside. Not a lot is filmed outside. There's Norma's costume, which is black. It's very dark. Death freezes time. It keeps her in the past. And what else would I say? Yeah, just generally Norma's sort of frozen in time. Like she had this good acting career, but it's gone now and it's not coming back. So these are kind of the key symbols of the film. In terms of essay topics, I've got this one here. How is death portrayed as a lingering presence in Sunset Boulevard? What I'll do is I will leave this topic for you to work on during the week if you'd like. If you get stuck analyzing it, let me know. Generally, I'd recommend for body paragraph ideas, I would have 2 metaphorical things which die, and then 1 literal thing, and just the focus in the essay, because it's a how question, you want to focus on film techniques and just explain how they contribute. Yeah, so you could do like the death of careers and the death of old Hollywood, for example, or you could do like the death of self respect and relationships. So those are 2 ideas you could have. And then you could decide whether you wanted to talk about like the literal deaths, so Joe being killed at the end and Norma losing her sanity. So the death of like everything kind of falling apart, that could be your third body. Or another third body idea could be hope. So you can talk about how everything gets fixed up. Okay, next time we will finish death. We'll just like recap the essay topic. And then we will also plan the hope body paragraph.